We're going to continue to look at the Sermon on the Mount this morning. So Matthew chapter 5, we're going to start in verse 38. I'm going to read that in just a minute. Savvy. You have a movie clip for me. Perfect. Cute movie. Funny movie. There's a larger point, though. As I watched that earlier in the week, there is something that is, can we say, satisfying about that movie clip. Gru, the weird-looking guy with the black outfit and the big gun, does something. What does he do? What is he trying to accomplish? Right? He's trying to get revenge. He feels that his kids were slighted, that this carnival game, like probably a lot of carnival games, are rigged against him, or rigged against his girls, that he thought was unfair. So Gru says, well, I'll fix this. Pulls out the gun and gets his revenge. Again, that feels satisfying, I think. It feels good. We watch that and are entertained and we laugh, and rightly so. But doesn't that say something about kind of where our culture is at, where our society is at, when we feel like we've been wrong? I know it's a kid's movie, and I don't want to belabor the point. But I think that attitude, that desire for revenge, reflects our culture. Reflects our cultural understanding. So in the kids' movie, we see that and we laugh about it. As we get older, we hear things like, don't get mad, get even. That's kind of the grown-up version of what we just saw. Jesus has something very different to say about revenge, about retaliation. Matthew chapter 5, we're going to start in verse 38. Let me just read the passage and then we'll come back and look at it in a little bit more detail. Verse 38, you have heard it was said, this is Jesus speaking, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, don't resist an evildoer. On the contrary, if anyone slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. As for the one who wants to sue you and take away your shirt, let him have your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to the one who asks you, and don't turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Again, verse 43, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But Jesus says, I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Don't even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brother, what are you doing out of the ordinary? Don't even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Jesus starts out with what would have been very familiar for everybody that was hearing him that day or that afternoon whenever he said these words. This idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, this is taken almost verbatim from some of the Mosaic law. You don't have to turn there, but you can read it in Exodus chapter 21, verses 22 through 25. It talks about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth and a bruise for a bruise and a burn for a burn, and you get the idea. Deuteronomy chapter 19 also picks up on this idea. So Jesus' words, this statement, this saying, that everybody knew that. They probably grew up hearing that, taught in their version of church. So Jesus says, you've heard it was said. This is how it's always been done, an eye for an eye. And then he makes that statement that we've seen several times now, verse 39, but I tell you. Verse 44, but I tell you. What Jesus is doing is he's not so much, we've talked about in this past, not so much doing away with the law, but he is fulfilling it, he is transforming it, and he is on some level reinterpreting it for them. See, what the Pharisees, what the religious leaders, what so many people had missed during that time is that while this principle, this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth principle was a good idea, and again, this was a God idea, this was something that was God ordained, it was never meant to determine the way that we treat other people on an individual basis. Again, you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 19, and it talks about this eye for an eye thing. That passage also mentions judges. The principle was the foundation for the Mosaic law, or the judicial or the legal system in the Old Testament. It was the platform upon which their understanding of criminal code or punishment for criminals was built. And in that sense, it was a very good thing, and even a very merciful thing. It acknowledged that wrong had been done. It acknowledged that wrong should be punished. But it also limited what the punishment was. It limited how far you could take this retaliation or this punishment out. Understand that when we talk about an eye for an eye, the natural tendency, I think, for most of us, if you take one of my eyes, my inclination, my desire is going to be to take both of yours. And so there's a piece of this that's very merciful, it's very even, it's very fair. But know that, even in the Old Testament, when we see this instruction, this wasn't to be a personal thing. This was the legal system. This was the court system. This was how the nation or the society handled it. This instruction was never meant to be a guiding principle for personal relationships. Yet that is exactly what the religious leaders and what the culture in Jesus' time had done with it. They had turned this eye for an eye thing into, well, if you insult me, I'm going to insult you back. And if you come up and slap me, I'm going to slap you back. If you come and let your dog do his business in my front yard, I'm going to let my dog go and point him in your direction so you understand how this works. It was to be a legal precedent. To be how the legal society functioned. It was never to govern personal relationships. And yet clearly, people during Jesus' day struggled with that. And we struggle with this today. I remember when I was younger, when I was a kid, I have an older brother and a younger brother. And shockingly, we didn't always get along. Like we went at it sometimes. I remember we interpreted this law, twisted it in much the same way that I think a lot of people in Jesus' time did. Remember the golden rule, similar idea, do unto others as you would have them do to you. We twisted that a bit to the extent where if my brother hit me, that must mean he wants me to hit him back. Off we go. That's what Jesus is talking about. He's looking at personal relationships and he's saying, you guys are missing this. It was never meant to say that you could just take personal vengeance. It was never meant to say that you could take revenge on somebody. We realize that personal offenses are a fact of life. Whether they're purposeful, whether they're unintentional, whether they're based on ignorance or selfishness, we understand that as we relate to other people, as we interact with other people, there are always going to be those moments, there's always going to be those times when we feel somehow slighted. Whether it's at a carnival game, and that's kind of a weird example, whether that's with a family member, whether that's with a neighbor or a coworker, we realize just the reality of life is that those things are going to come up. That is going to happen. Jesus acknowledges this. I believe when he says this, Jesus goes on, he talks about this eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and then he gives four kind of examples or four pictures of what this might look like. Let's just quickly look at those. Starts off, verse 39, if anyone slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. There's somebody I can pick on. Jim, you haven't been picked on for a while. Stand up real quick. You don't even have to do anything. Here's how this worked. No, you don't need that. Okay. I'm right-handed. In that time, in Jesus' day, it was culturally appropriate to be right-handed, like you weren't left-handed. If you were born left-handed, your parents tried to change you into being right-handed. Your left hand was always considered unclean, so you wouldn't do anything with your left hand. If I'm right-handed and I slap Jim, which cheek am I going to hit? Left. What did Jesus say? If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, how can I slap Jim on the right-handed, with my right hand? How do I slap Jim on the right cheek? There's two ways, right? One of them I would have to do this, kind of twist my hand around, and that's not going to be very effective. The other way, as you said, would be with the back of my hand, right? When Jesus says, if anyone slaps you, thank you. Yeah. When Jesus says, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, understand this just wasn't, it wasn't just the violence of the act. There was something culturally that was repulsive about a backhanded slap. It would be akin, maybe, this is kind of my interpretation of it, but it would be akin almost to, in our culture, giving somebody the finger. Not only was there physical violence involved with the act, but it was a huge insult as well. Like the punishment. If you got caught and were taken to court over this, the punishment for a backhanded slap was twice what the punishment for an open-handed slap. Do you understand? So Jesus he uses this as an analogy. He just presents this as a picture and says, look, if anyone slaps you, if anyone insults you, turn the other cheek. He goes on and gives another example, verse 40. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your shirt, let him have your coat as well. Again, there's a cultural piece to this. Typically, men in that time would wear, I think we would call it a tunic, kind of a long shirt, and then they would have a cloak that they would wear around their shoulders and probably have a belt and all that. This cloak thing also doubled as their bedding. So that was their sheet, that was their blanket at night. You would wrap yourself in your cloak, and that's how you would stay warm. Typically, men would have several of these shirts, but the outer garment, the cloak, was expensive. That was a valuable piece of clothing. Usually, people would only have one of those. Under the Mosaic law, if you took somebody's cloak, outer garments, as a pledge, as a promise, legally you had to give it back before nightfall. That's what the Mosaic law said. You could keep it during the day, but you had to give it back to him before nighttime. That's how valuable, that's how serious this piece of clothing was. And yet Jesus says, listen, if anyone wants to sue you, want your shirt, give them your shirt, but also give them your cloak as well. It's almost as if he's saying, look, be willing to give up even some of your legal rights. Like legally, they couldn't do that. Jesus is talking about these types of relationships and these types of occurrences and interactions, and he says, be willing even to give up some of your legal rights. The third example he gives, if anyone, verse 41, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. I don't think we really have a category for this. Understand, first century Israel was occupied by the Romans. If a Roman soldier asked you to carry a load, it was compulsory. In other words, you did not have a choice. You had to carry a load for up to 1 mile. Which is part of being occupied, part of having this occupying force. We have a picture of this when Jesus is about to be crucified. Remember, he's whipped, he's beaten, and he's supposed to carry his cross to the hill where he's actually going to be crucified. Physically, Jesus, the Bible tells us, is so weak that he cannot. And they Simon of Cyrene. It wasn't like Simon volunteered to carry Jesus' cross. He didn't have a choice. It was compulsory. So Jesus says, if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Do more than what is required by law. Do more than what you are bound to do. The last one, give to the one, verse 42, give to the one who asks. Don't turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. We think about borrowing, we think about being generous, and I think automatically we go to money. I believe that part of what Jesus is saying is that, yeah, be generous with those even if you know they're not able or not going to repay or maybe haven't repaid in the past. But I believe that this is more than just a money thing. Jesus is talking about, again, with these people, remember the context is people that have offended you. Jesus is saying, look, be generous. There's people who have wronged you. Be generous, sure, financially. Be generous with your resources. Be generous with your time. As I was thinking about this, my mind went back soon after Krista and I were married. We moved from where we were living to about 2.5 hours away to another place. I think Allie was born at that time. We didn't have a whole lot of stuff, but it was like, one truck and one trailer, and we did our thing. Anyway, we asked some friends and family members to help us move. We got a lot of help. There was a particular family, though, that didn't help and said they couldn't help us move because they were too busy. I don't remember exactly what they're doing, but I remember thinking at the time that whatever excuse they gave was rather loud. Like, it was like really that, just say that you don't want to, if that's what you're going to do. Time went by, 6 months, whatever it was, and it turns out that this family who refused to help us move also decided that they were going to move, and they were just moving 10 miles or something from one town to the next town. And sure enough, don't they ask us to help them? I wish that I could stand here and say that I was eager and anxious to help them move. I wasn't. My first thought, no. You guys didn't help me. You made some lousy excuse about having to do your laundry or something that day. It's clear that you were too busy and just didn't want to. And you have the audacity to turn around and ask me? I believe that's exactly what Jesus is talking about when he talks about being slighted or being offended, having these types of things come up in our relationship with other people. And so when he says, be generous, be willing to give to the one who asks. Be generous even to those who have refused to be generous to you in the past. In each of these cases, these 4 pictures that Jesus presents, and we could, as a group, I'm sure, come up with lots and lots more examples. In each of these cases, I think our natural reaction, and again, I wish I could stand and say, yeah, I always got this right. I don't. But in these cases, in these scenarios, I believe our natural reaction kind of follows this rather predictable pattern, this rather predictable path. Right away, our first instinct, our first reaction seems to be that what I would call indignation. We become indignant, we become incensed. How dare they do that to me? How dare they insult me or offend me or slight me or cheat me or are generous to me because I'm really important? How dare they say that to me? You see, that's the immediate, at least for me, that's the immediate reaction. And we're honest, we know what that feels like, and our temperature just begins to rise. We can become angry and even incensed. The next step then is retaliation. Somehow, I'm going to pay them back. I'm going to get even with them. Sometimes that takes the form of a physical act of violence. But I want to be clear, and I know that was one of Jesus' examples about being slapped, and I don't want to say that never happens. Understand that from time to time we get in physical altercations. But I suspect that more often than physical retaliation, more often than hitting somebody, more often than taking our car and putting a dent in theirs, that more often we use words, we use attitudes, we withhold. Oh, you didn't help me move? I ain't carrying your boxes down the steps. You need help moving your freezer? Good luck. Find somebody else. I think more often we go on social media, oh, you broke up with me? Let me tell the world a couple secrets that maybe aren't so great about you. These are words, sometimes they're actions, sometimes I think we try to retaliate just by being indifferent, just by avoiding. Oh, you didn't invite me to your Christmas party? Guess who's not going to invite you to the next party I have? I know that's rather passive-aggressive. And I think sometimes we look at that and we say, well, that's not really wrong. Like, I didn't actually do anything. I didn't actually say anything. But we understand how this works. If the attitude is somehow, I've been slighted by this person, now I'm going to figure out how to retaliate. I'm going to figure out how to pay them back. Church, we can retaliate without saying anything. We can retaliate by just building that wall and avoiding and being indifferent and ignoring them. Jesus says, but I tell you, don't resist an evildoer. Verse 44, he says, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Don't resist. Don't set yourself against. Don't determine in your heart to set yourself against your personal enemy. To set yourself against this person that has somehow slighted you, offended you, whatever the case is. And I maybe should stop and be clear, because I want to make sure we have the context and understand the context of this. Hear me when I say, Jesus is not saying that you should subject yourself to abuse. Jesus is not saying that you need to remain in a situation where you are being just constantly treated badly. Jesus is not saying that you cannot use the law, take advantage of the legal system that is available to you. And we see numerous examples of that. Jesus resisted people on time. Jesus kept people from killing him from time to time. The Apostle Paul, on many occasions, uses the law, uses legal avenues. Says, no, you can't arrest me. I'm a Roman citizen. You can't whip me without cause because I'm a Roman citizen. So just make sure, hear the context. This is not an excuse. This is not enabling someone to abuse or to take advantage of you. This really is a heart issue. This really is how do we respond to these personal insults, these personal relationships? How do you respond to your neighbor, your sibling, your family member, your coworker? Jesus says, don't set yourself up against them. Don't hate them. The Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, had so twisted this idea. They said, yeah, you're supposed to love your neighbor, but you're supposed to hate your enemies. Jesus says, no. You're missing it. Church, I understand that this is hard. I understand that this is not easy. This is not our natural reaction. I started off this morning, we watched that short video clip, and I said there's something satisfying about watching Lou blow that little carnival stand up. There's something that appeals to us on some level. And I read Jesus' words, and we see the contrast, and so I realized, just let's be honest and say, this is hard. This is hard. It's easy to retaliate. It's easy to use our words to tear somebody down. It's hard to not take things into our own hand. Jesus taught this. Jesus also modeled it as well. If you have your Bibles, just quickly, let's turn to Mark chapter 15. Mark chapter 15, we'll just pick it up in verse 17. Mark chapter 15, starting in verse 17, they dressed him, that's Jesus, in a purple robe, twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on him. They began to salute him mockingly, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." They kept hitting him on the head with a reed and spitting on him. Getting down on their knees, they were paying him homage. When they had mocked him, they stripped him of his purple robe. They put his clothes on him and led him out to be crucified. Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 2, this is Peter's commentary on that. Peter says, For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to the one who judges justly. Jesus acknowledges this is a tough teaching. Jesus acknowledges that this is difficult. Charles Spurgeon said of this idea that we are to be as the anvil when bad men are the hammers. But went on to say that an anvil is one thing and a doormat is another. Jesus doesn't call us to revenge, but Jesus doesn't call us to be a doormat either. Jesus doesn't call us to be the aggressor, but nor does he call us to be passive. Look again at this text. Verse 39, Jesus says, don't resist an evildoer. Verse 44, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Far from being weak, Jesus was the strongest man, the strongest individual, the most complete person that ever lived. Jesus had amazing power. And yet Jesus is also called meek. We looked at that a few weeks ago in the Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek, the gentle, for they shall inherit the earth. And I talked about at that time that this word meekness in the Bible pictures a horse, pictures a workhorse. If you think about the power that a horse has, the strength that a horse has. We have horses. Jim Gordon has horses. And if you've ridden a horse, if you've been in a sleigh or in a cart being pulled by a horse, you can feel the strength of that animal. You can feel how much power that animal has. And yet God in his wisdom, God in his sovereignty has created them so that they can be domesticated, so that they can be trained, so that they can be brought under control. And that's the picture of meekness. Meekness is not weakness. Meekness is power under control. Pictures of a horse. Incredible strength. There is nothing, if a horse got it into his head that he or she was going to go that way, there's physically nothing that you could do to stop it. And yet we see all the time, with buggies going by, that people are able to control horses. That's the picture, strength under control. And that's the picture that applies to this. Jesus doesn't call us to be weak. He calls us to be meek. He sets the boundaries. Jesus refused to do certain things, but he doesn't respond in kind. He doesn't retaliate. Let me give you 3 ways that we can respond in these situations. Number 1, instead of indignation, instead of this self-righteous, how dare they do that to me? Introspection. Instead of elevating ourselves and just getting incensed because they slighted us, maybe the place to start is a little bit of introspection. Maybe the place to start is to realize that we too have gravely offended God. And that at some point in our lives, we have most certainly offended or slighted or wronged another person. There's not one of us here that's perfect. There's not one of us here who, like Jesus, can say, I never offended, I never slighted. I don't remember that song. It was a song that was popular. I just remember hearing it when I was a kid. Have patience, don't be in such a hurry. Remember. When we start to worry, God is patient too. Anyway, there's a line in that song that's talking about patience. And just remember that there have been times when other people have had to wait for you. That's the picture here. Respond by realizing that I'm not perfect. That we're no better than those who offend us. And that not only have we offended other people, but we have most certainly offended God, who is perfectly holy. We have offended God by sinning, by not living up to His holy standard. That's what the Bible calls sin. And yet God in His mercy, God in His grace, saw fit to make a way that we might be forgiven, that we might be redeemed. God in His grace and His mercy forgives us. If you are a believer, if you have repented and confessed that Jesus Christ is your Lord, if you have come to Him and asked for His forgiveness, the Bible tells us that you have been forgiven, that you have received it. That act of salvation, that act of forgiveness, flies in the face of revenge. It flies in the face of this idea of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, because God does not give us what we deserve. Recognizing that we too are sinners, recognizing that we too have received mercy and grace from God, I believe is the place to start. Number 2, instead of retaliation, faith. Faith. Justice is not a bad thing. It's not. In fact, justice is a good thing. Justice is a godly thing. God is a just God. Perfectly just. That's why God has to punish sin. That's why Jesus died on the cross for us. So justice is a good thing. Again, when we think about being offended, we think about being wrong. It is well and good and proper that we have a desire to see justice done. So this isn't a justice issue. Justice is a good thing. And now listen to me when I say this. Revenge in and of itself is not a bad thing. It's just not your job. It's not my job. Romans chapter 12, verse 19, Beloved, never avenge yourself, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Revenge is not a bad thing. It's just not your job. It's not my job. The Bible tells us that it's God's job, and that's why I say instead of retaliation, instead of seeking vengeance for against those who have offended us, we need to respond with faith. Respond with faith that God is the just judge, that God will wrong every right, that God will see justice done. Remember what Peter says when he talks about Jesus, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23. Jesus continued entrusting himself to the one who judges justly. You take the word entrusting out and you could insert faith. Jesus continued to have faith that God would ensure that justice was done. So we begin with some introspection and an honest evaluation of who we are and what we are. We move on to faith. We respond by faith and saying, it doesn't excuse the wrong. It doesn't ignore the wrong. It simply says, God, I trust that you are bigger than this, that you are able to take care of this, that you will take care of this, and that ultimately justice will be done. Number 3, instead of indifference, love. Look at verse 44. Jesus says, but I tell you, love your enemies. Martin Luther King said that hate breeds hate and leads to a descending spiral of violence. Dr. King goes on to say that love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. The Pharisees that Jesus is addressing had perverted the command to love your neighbor, using it as an excuse to hate your enemies. I know that we talk about hate, and this is, I think, a good thing in our culture. We look at hate and we treat it as if it is the 4-letter word that it actually is. You look at schools, you look at what we teach our kids, and we say hate is wrong. And that's good. Jesus, though, doesn't just say don't hate your enemy. Jesus says love your enemy. There's a big difference between not hating and loving. We agree on that? There's a big difference between not hating and loving. Again, St. Augustine said, many have learned how to offer the other cheek, but do not know how to love him by whom we were struck. We know how to not hate, but we struggle with knowing how to actually love, and yet that's the command. I want to be clear what we're talking about. In the Greek language, there's several different words that are used for love. Know that Jesus is not talking about the love between a parent and child. He's not talking about the love between you and your best friend. He's not talking about the love between you and your spouse. Jesus uses love in this context. What he means is desiring good, desiring genuine good for that person. You don't have to love them like you do your best friend. You don't have to care about them like you do their best friend. You don't have to love them like you love your husband or wife. And I would add that you shouldn't love that person like you love your husband or wife unless they are, in fact, your husband or wife. Make sense? Amen. Fair? Jesus says love your enemy. What he means is desire good for them. Desire that God would cause them to flourish. Through the medium of prayer, we go to our enemy and we stand by his side and we plead for him to God. I don't think it's by accident that Jesus says, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. Again, Jesus knows how hard this is. Jesus knows how difficult this is for us. Jesus knows that the only thing we may be able to do, the only loving thing that we may physically, realistically be able to do to someone who is wrong to us is to pray for them. I believe that's why that's where Jesus starts. If you can do nothing else, and this is an excuse to do nothing else, if you cannot physically make yourself do good, Jesus says begin by praying for them. I don't believe that you can sincerely, legitimately, honestly pray for someone for any length of time and continue to hate them. I don't believe that you can do it. It's just in God's economy. I believe that's just not how it works. So Jesus says, look, here's the place to start. Pray that God will cause them to flourish. Think about Jesus, and think about somebody like Stephen in the book of Acts. Remember, Stephen is arrested, he's put on trial, he's condemned to death for preaching about Jesus Christ. And as the men are picking up rocks to smash down on his head, Stephen prays, says, God, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The only loving thing that Stephen could do in that time was to pray for them. And know that by praying, forgive them, Father, for they know he is praying for their good. He is praying that God would get a hold of their lives, that they would flourish. There's lots of things I believe that we can do in these types of relationships to show that we care, to show that we love. But the first thing that we should always do is pray. Beyond that, the context, the situation, I believe guides our response. It guides what is appropriate. It guides what love looks like. But that question, the question, how can I seek the good of this person? That's the right question to ask. Right actions follow the right question. Maybe that's a kind word. Maybe that's a gesture. Maybe that's carrying the freezer down their steps. Maybe that's inviting the person to your birthday party, even if they didn't invite you to theirs. Let me wrap this up. Why? Why do we do this? Why does Jesus call us to this? Why does Jesus give not a suggestion? This is a good idea, you should do this. Why does Jesus offer this command? But I tell you, don't resist an evil. Love your enemies. That's not optional. Why are we called to this? Very quickly, I'm going to give you 3 reasons actually. Number 1, we are image bearers. As men and women made in the image and likeness of God, We are to bear his image. We are to model him to the world at large. Verse 45, Jesus says that God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. We image God when we extend love, when we extend grace and mercy to even those who are unlovely, because that's what God not just did, but that's what God does for us even today. God causes good. God blesses those people, even those people that hate him, even those people that deny his very existence. Jesus says that God still causes them good, that God in that sense still loves them. And as we bear his image, we are called to that as well. The second thing I would point out is that we are his sons and his daughters. That you may be sons of your Father in heaven, verse 45. As called out people, we are to be different. As called out people, this kind of goes along with the first. We are to reflect the image of our Heavenly Father. Jesus points out that listen, even sinners, even tax collectors, even thieves and murderers love those people who love them. So if all you do is love those people who like you and are nice to you, you're no different than the world. Jesus goes on to say, verse 48, be perfect, therefore, as your Heavenly Father is perfect. Number 3, Jesus says we're called to be mature Christians. And that's really what that idea of perfection there is. It's not so much that we are perfect and that we never sin, but it's that we are mature, that we're perfect in terms of what we are called and who we are called to be. Let me close with this verse and would ask you to turn there. Luke chapter 6, verse 35. Luke adds a third reason. And it's in Matthew, but it's clear in the passage in Luke. Luke chapter 6, verse 35. Again, Jesus speaking, but love your enemies, do what is good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. We've heard that, we've talked about that. But then look what else Jesus says. Then your reward will be great. We sons of the Most High. Enemies take away. Enemies image the devil and that. They lie, they cheat, they steal, they rob us. God gives back. The promise that Jesus makes for those who are his sons and his daughters, for those who are following him, for those who are bearing his image, is that even in these situations, hard though they may be, Jesus says there is a great reward for those who by faith allow God to be the judge, who by faith allow God to right the wrongs. There's a reward for those who love instead of hate. As the music team comes forward, let me just leave you with this quote. It goes like this: to return evil for evil is devilish. To return good for good is human. To return good for evil is divine. Let me close with a word of prayer. God, I thank you for our time this morning. We talked about it earlier. God, I just thank you for the freedom that we have, that we can boldly and openly read your word and celebrate your word together. God, as all of these passages have been over the last couple of weeks, God, this is hard. In many ways feels unnatural for us to love our enemies, to not seek vengeance or seek to retaliate against those who do us wrong. God, we confess that, we acknowledge that. We acknowledge that's why we need you. So we just ask that you would continue to work in us, that you would change our hearts, that you would empower us to be the people that you have called us to be, that we might love as you do. God, we thank you. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.